Yes, Olya Khaleelee from London. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Hüseyin. Nice to be here.
Yes, we will prepare a conference here in Germany. So, what do you think is important if one prepares a conference from your point of view? How do you normally prepare conferences?
How do I normally prepare conferences? Well, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I like to do a lot of work beforehand. I like to do most of the work beforehand, actually, because I find once I'm in the conference, there are too many other roles and other demands on my attention, so I like to have done my thinking well beforehand. And so that will involve everything. That will involve knowing quite a lot about the membership that's coming. I will have sorted out the lists in terms of small groups and all that kind of thing, review groups. I like doing that because it helps me to get to know what it is I'm working with. I know there are other conferences where people allocate themselves, don't they, in the more modern conference, but being more traditional, I regard that as an important part of it. And the other thing is about conference design, which I will have thought about even earlier. What kind of design? What am I trying to achieve? And of course the conferences I've worked on vary between a pure group relations conference and, if you like, a more applied conference where, say, if you're doing perhaps a conference for leaders and you want them to have a different kind of experience from a purely experiential. So I do quite a lot of thinking beforehand. And of course I'm involved in writing the brochure and getting the staff and thinking about the staffing, all those, everything actually, everything. So I'm immersed in it. And also, of course, depending which conference it is, then there may also be a directorate which has got a unit that is working possibly 6-7 months before the conference starts, meeting quite regularly, working together, thinking about it.
So directorate means the director, the associate director?
Yes, and the administrative staff, yes. But it just depends on the size of the conference, and I'm thinking particularly of the conferences I ran for the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, which were huge conferences. They're not as long as a Leicester, so they're not so demanding from that point of view, but they are very demanding.
How long are they now?
They're 5 days.
5 days.
But they take place within the institution.
I see. So it's not residential?
It's not residential. And also some people are required to attend, so you're not just using your own authority. Some people have to attend, some people don't have to attend, and not only that, so the conference takes place, you have to create a skin within the institution to hold the conference, but you've got about 100 people coming.
Employees? Not only employees?
No, people on courses.
Oh, I see.
Yes, to child psychotherapists and social workers and all sorts of people on different courses, and part of their course requirement is that they're expected to come, or they have to come. I have a problem with that actually, but anyway, those are their kind of requirements. So you have to create a skin within the institution.
Like a boundary?
Yes, like a boundary, and it is a very, very thin skin. And what you find is, at times it's a leaky boundary.
And you use their rooms in the institute, or?
Yes, you use the rooms in the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, and those conferences. I mean, they're very fascinating, but psychologically, emotionally, quite demanding. How to hold it, and I've had all sorts of thoughts about those conferences.
I remember talking about it. 90 members sometimes, or 80 to 90. Or 100 you even said.
Yes.
Huge.
Yes, oh yes, huge. So you think of a large group that size. And in fact the space isn't necessarily large enough, really. And you're on the boundary of health and safety. And what I found was that people tended to self-regulate so that 100 people wouldn't come. 80 might come. They self-regulated in some way that systemically some people just wouldn't
join up,
wouldn't arrive for that particular session. They'd be in the conference, but they wouldn't necessarily come to that particular.
So you have 80 average, and then
80 average.
I see. So they self-regulated.
They self-regulated, yes, which I thought was rather.
So how many staff do you need for this kind of?
Oh gosh, I had about 12.
12.
Yes, and also you had a training group in that as well, and a rather different design to say the training group at a Leicester conference. Very interesting actually, because those conferences, the training group came and worked with management in their staff meetings in a participant observer role for part of the meeting, not all of the meeting, but to have them there. It meant that in directing it, there would be times when you'd have about 20 people in the room. You'd have your staff and the training group all present. And you needed to manage that process. So always in a median group dynamic, if you like. And but it was very interesting, and I think people learnt a lot. I certainly learnt a lot from that.
When did you start with group relations work? Do you remember?
Well, I started, this will date me of course, I started in the late 70s. My very first group relations conference where I went as a member was 1973, and then I went again in 1976, and I think my first staff membership was 1978.
78?
Yes. Now I was working in industry at that time, and Eric Miller was our external consultant. I was part of an internal consulting group, and he used to come in every week as our external consultant, and it was as a result of his work with us that I landed up going to these conferences and then eventually coming on the staff. And I think probably it was partly that I worked in industry, and you need a staff balance, and I think from that point of view, given that I was young, female and in industry, that was probably added some diversity to the staff group.
So he came to your company once a week? Was there
yes, he came once a week.
Or so?
No, what happened was I was working with a colleague for one of the managing directors of this organisation, and we had been sent into this company, which was a subsidiary that had been merged with an already owned organisation belonging to this. But they were competitors. They put two competitors together, and then there was some surprise that the organisation didn't function. So the person I was working with, he and I were sent in to kind of try and ameliorate the situation. And there came a point where my boss went to the Tavistock Institute and met this man, Dr. Eric Miller, and posed a question to him, which was, how do you offer an interpretation to 1,000 people?
Very interesting question.
And it was on the basis of that discussion with him, which I wasn't present at, but that Eric Miller then came and began consulting to this organisation. And in fact, what happened as a result was that over the next 5 years, he and we implemented an application of the Leicester Conference in this organisation.
In that early years?
Yes, in those early years. And it was a pretty direct application, because what we managed to do was to have small groups, an intergroup and a large group, with the 128 managers of all levels that were in that organisation. And so that was really very, very interesting dynamically to understand. It helped us understand the organisation. As a result of that, that was part of a people programme, and we were known as the head shrinkers. We had our own little room and space, and people used to walk by and look in our window, and we had a little column that was called the head shrinkers column in there, in the site newspaper. So we developed a reputation. But the large group was very interesting. I didn't work on it, but Eric and my colleague, Andrew Schmidler was his name, they worked on it together, and that was a large group for all 128 managers once a week for an hour and a half, looking at the task being to examine the state of the organisation.
Do you remember how long how many weeks or?
Oh, it went on for a year and a half.
For a year and a half.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes, and people came from every level. They were allowed to. Because the management of the organisation were very progressive, and it was also the era of industrial democracy in the 1970s, and with trade union representation on boards. Of course, you're much more advanced here in Germany than we ever were in England, but nevertheless, trade unions were quite powerful, and there was a unionisation on this particular site. But the management were very, very progressive, and also they'd been given the task of turning this organisation around. So it was a tremendous challenge when everybody else had tried and failed. And we, as the kind of sort of organisational consultants, behavioural, thinking systemically and psychoanalytically, we were a last resort. They tried everything else, and they thought, well, nothing's working. We'll divest ourselves of this organisation, but before we do, we'll just give it a go with these people, see if it works, and it did.
And the method was like the large group in a group relations conference. Have you been sitting in a circle or?
No, they sat in, I think in those days they sat in concentric circles.
In concentric.
That was prior to the spiral coming in.
I see.
Yes, they sat in a huge space. And yes, once a week.
And Eric was alone?
No, Eric with my colleague.
Okay, who was internal?
Yes, he and I were the internal consultants, and Eric was the external. And so he used to come in every week. I must say, Eric and I weren't very friendly. We sort of looked at each other somewhat askance. I saw this rather dry-looking Englishman with leather elbows who was sat there smoking a pipe and looking rather like that. Lugubrious. So I thought, that's strange.
Was he sharp with his interventions? Or?
Yes, he had a sharp intelligence. Yes, he did. Yes. But he wasn't sharp. He wasn't sharp in the use of his voice. Actually, he often came at things in a very humorous way. Yes.
So that the people could take it.
Yes,
right?
They could take it. I remember actually at a Leicester conference. It must have been in the late 70s. I was in the large group trying to grapple with that staff role, which was extremely difficult. And I remember Eric was there, and somehow a subgroup had arranged itself around him, or he found himself somehow with this subgroup, and he made an intervention about it. He said, I've got them sitting in front of me, I have them sitting behind me, I have them sitting to the right of me, I have them sitting to the left of me. People laughed, but it enabled them to examine what was going on. He was very, he had a very natural, intuitive, he worked very much from his feelings in taking up the role. Very, he really could use a systemic and psychoanalytic way of thinking. And he had a very macro conception, but he was also very detailed. He had both, whereas I had neither. Actually, I was neither as macro as him, nor as detailed. I was but I had the middle. I held the middle ground.
What was his role at the time of Eric at that institute?
Yes, he was head of the group relations training program at the institute.
For many years, right?
Yes, for many years, and he sat on the third floor. And in fact, when you entered the building, once they they demerged from the Tavistock clinic and went into their own building where they are now, and it used to just say third floor, Eric Miller.
Really?
He was like a kind of institution.
Like in the institute.
Yes, yes. He was a one-man institution. Yes. But,
So you worked together for a long time then?
Yes, we did. Yes, we met originally in 1975, and then yes, we did. And of course, I married him in 1982. So we had those 7 years, and thereafter, of course, I couldn't work at Leicester. When he was there, I wasn't there. So, and I came and worked in Germany. Throughout the 1980s, I was working in Germany on group relations in Germany, Mundo. Yes, because and that was also with the help of Gordon Lawrence, because Gordon Lawrence and I had worked very closely together when I took up the directorship of Opus in 1980. And Gordon had been had quite a powerful impact on developing group relations here, particularly the socio-technical systems event which he designed. And it wasn't directly with him, through him, but there was a kind of connection which also came with Carsten Trebesch attending Leicester, meeting me. He was a member, I was on the staff. We met and he realised I spoke some German, a bit, and then he brought me in to group relations in Germany. So I was here quite a lot during the 1980s.
Opus, what is Opus?
Opus, Organisation for Promoting Understanding in Society. Well, Opus was set up in 1975 by a man called Sir Charles Goodeve, and he was quite an eminent scientist. He had developed operational research after World War II, and he was also very interested in how workers functioned in industry. And he came to a point of thinking that if they understood more of the systems they were part of, they'd be less likely to go on strike. And I think he came at this from quite a conservative angle, actually.
Interesting.
But he thought, well, you know, they're always kind of sort of in their little silos, as it were. They had a better perspective. They would see how they were being manipulated at times, or to walk out, or go on wildcat strikes, this kind of thing. So what he did was he approached the Tavistock Institute to see whether he could develop this organisation within it. And Eric didn't think it quite fitted. He also approached the Industrial Society, which was another charity, which had a link with the Tavistock Institute, and they didn't think it was quite right either. So both those institutions encouraged him to set up on his own, which he did. And the Industrial Society seconded someone, who's now the chairman of Opus actually, seconded someone to sort of help him in a kind of administratively. Now, Sir Charles was ill with Parkinson's, in fact, during the late 70s. So by the time I came to the end of my time in this as an internal consultant, they were looking for a director and I was looking for a job. And Eric was a policy advisor of Opus. So he thought I'd be good in that role. They had a little bit of money. I was then anyway developing as a psychotherapist as well, and I was going to go freelance. So I took on the directorship in 1980. And Eric was a tremendous, always very, very fascinated by the whole systemic and societal elements that Opus concerns itself with.
It was a full-time job for you? Or?
It was in year one. In year one it was a full-time job, paid job, and thereafter it was a kind of like a bit like having a child, a constant preoccupation, but it was great fun. And Eric and I we wrote a quarterly bulletin, and we wrote 30 of these and published them. We developed a group of associates. Several of our colleagues, who are still colleagues today, came in and worked on this very closely. Gordon Lawrence was in it, Brendan Duddy, people like Miranda Feuchtwang and Sheila Ramsey, Tim Dartington. Quite a lot of us came together and sort of met regularly. We developed the idea of the listening post, the idea that you can tap into societal preoccupations through a small group.
Listening post.
A listening
they
post.
Meet every quarterly or so?
Yes, we used to meet every quarter. I think they still do, actually. And Lionel Stapley, who took over from me in 1995, I think it was 95 or 94, he then developed it, took it much, much further, and it's now become a global phenomenon. He's done brilliantly with it. But it was the whole idea, I think, that Eric was particularly preoccupied with, which was, does society have an unconscious? Can one think about unconscious processes at a societal level? And I think there was quite a lot of evidence to suggest that one could. And, had he lived, I'm sure he would have done a lot more conceptual work on that. But he did a lot, and he loved the work. Yes, and I did. I enjoyed it too. But I think towards the end of my time, I began to find it was difficult to juggle doing that with everything else you needed to do to sort of keep life ticking over.
The style of Eric running a group relations conference, what would you say? Is it possible to say, how was it? Director style?
His style was very low-key.
Low-key?
Low-key. So, for example, in the staff room, there were no tables. The staff room simply had a circle of armchairs. There'd be little coffee tables in front where you could put your stuff if you wanted to. And he would sit anywhere. He always sat anywhere. It didn't matter where he sat because he was the authority. And that was a wonderful example, of leadership. And he was quiet, thoughtful, slow speaking. In the early days, of course, you were allowed to smoke. So he would be smoking. He'd usually have a cigarette, possibly a drink, depending on what time of day it was, next to him, possibly lunchtime or whatever. And his style was ordered but quiet, quite still. He allowed people a lot of room to find their authority. It was a very distinctive style. You wouldn't normally think of somebody with that style as having a powerful leadership capacity, but he did. It was very containing. He soaked things up without it being obvious that he was soaking anything up. Very, very calm. You didn't have a sense with him that he had to take charge of things. It wasn't as though he felt any need to be in control. It was as though he wasn't in control. It's very interesting.
What would you say is the most important aspect you learned from him in running conferences?
It's a difficult question. Be prepared. Be prepared. Yes, make sure you've done your homework. Be aware of the fact that as the director, there's always going to be resentment. Eventually, staff feelings, what is projected in from the membership and what staff are doing to each other as well, is always going to come to you. There comes a point where you do need to address it. And yes, I learned that you will always have to deal with those things if you're in a leadership position. So that was important. And the other thing was something about, I think I learnt quite a lot about his calmness. There was one occasion during the 1970s, late 70s, there was a whole era of plane hijacks, people being kidnapped and stuff like that. And I can remember, of course, the conferences are influenced by societal phenomena, inevitably. I can remember on one occasion we were at Digby Hall then, in Leicester. We were coming through, some of us, from the dining room to the coffee area. And Eric was behind me, just a little way behind. And in front of me was a staff member called Peter Barham. And as we entered this coffee area, some of the members suddenly swooped on him and carried him off. They kidnapped him and took him off up the road. It wasn't funny, I'm laughing now in retrospect. I was completely terrified. And I turned to Eric, I was agitated, and I said, "They've kidnapped Peter, kidnapped Peter." He was completely calm. Completely calm. God knows what he felt. But he was. And 4 hours later they released Peter. But it was calm. He called a staff meeting, discussed how we were going to manage this. I think some ransom demands were coming down from Inglewood House where they'd secreted him. And I think it was quite an experience for Peter as well. Quite scary actually. And I think the other thing that became clear from Eric's experiences in running many of these conferences was that after a period of time you get to see most things. And he always said, there is a risk as a director that you will get institutionalized, and this is not helpful to the work. And he always used to think that the new staff member was often going to be more effective than somebody who worked on conferences a lot, because they didn't know what to expect and they had to work with the here and now, really in the here and now, and not with the past conferences in their minds. And I think he used to get a little bit concerned about whether over time he'd become too institutionalized himself to be able to work really effectively within the here and now.
So what was important for him while inviting staff? When he invited staff, did he look in terms of these differences or these
diversity? Yes, diversity. Yes, to have some stability, but also some newness. You want a little bit of what Anton calls fizz. You want a bit of fizz in your staff system.
Anton also?
Anton says that. He said it to me quite recently, actually. Yes, got
fizz?
A little bit of fizz. It means you want a little bit of unpredictability.
Because they are young and not
experienced.
Young and
not experienced.
You never know how they will react.
Exactly. A little bit of that's important. And keep staff on their toes as well. You need a little bit.
And allowing this,
yes,
right? And not just killing it. And
yes. No, you don't want everything. Otherwise, the learning gets blunted. Yes, and I think Eric did go for diversity in terms of, gender, race, age, experience. It has to be enough to be containing, but not so much that there isn't some newness as well. And also he was very developmental, bringing new people in. He was always very aware of the succession. And the other thing he did, which I think has got, I don't know if people hold to it today, I think it got lost over time. He always thought that when you bring in a new staff member into the Leicester conference, or any conference, you should always give them 2 goes. The first time may be a difficult experience for them, certainly Leicester can be. You bring them back again the next year.
Okay, Eric brought this
Yes.
in. I know this
Yes.
unhidden or rule, unspoken out rule, but
Yes.
okay.
Yes. He operated according to that. Should have two goes at it, because the second time would always feel very, very different from the first.
It's also a good example for the membership as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just going once, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe the second time
Yes.
to understand
Yes.
more and to
Yes.
experience more.
Yes, certainly. That was my experience. I mean, the first time I went, I was completely lost, no idea what was going on, and my boss was there, which was awful. The second time I went, I was in a very different state of mind. And in fact, the feedback the second time I went, I heard through the grapevine, was that the staff thought that I wanted to be a staff member.
How can they think like this?
I don't know how they picked up this ambition. It was pretty clear. Yeah.
Do you remember how Eric was debriefing himself when he finished conferences? So what did he do? Did he go away, or did he stay in the conference space for a while? Or?
Well, there were many conferences where he was directing or associate director and I wasn't present. And what would happen is that in the break, once when we were married, I would go and pick him up and we would go for a day to somewhere like Uppingham, somewhere in the vicinity, somewhere nice, and stay somewhere like that. Which was very, very pleasant. So he had a kind of break, and then afterwards he'd come back and he'd have a pause, and he would, it's something you want to chew over and digest. I don't know if they wrote directors' reports then. They may well have done even then, but certainly in my experience, you always had to write a report afterwards. I don't know if he did.
A long report, or?
Yeah, well.
2 pages, 3?
No, a bit longer than that.
Longer?
Yes, about the sort of the experience and the dynamics and the staffing and yes. But I don't know if he did, but he certainly liked to debrief. Yes, so he'd come home and unpack, and then what we used to do was we'd gather in the conservatory, sort of for cocktails, and sit and talk. And to some extent, the things he wanted to chew over. Of course, I was always very interested to know what had gone on. And so he'd tell me some of it, and I think that helped digest it. And the same was true of, when I landed up directing and he wasn't.
I'm sure he was very interested then as well.
Yes, he was. And he helped me a lot. Yeah.
It was a good sparring, so.
Sparring.
So do you say sparring?
Yes, we say yes. Do you mean like
debating?
Yeah.
Coaching,
Not so much like that. Not so. I think the first time I directed Leicester, he did give me some help because I had some difficulty conceptualising it, and he did give me some help with that. And I think, of course, part of my anxiety was the fact that I was married to this man who was the kind of guru of Leicester conferences. How on earth was I going to be able to do this successfully? This was a real issue the first time. That was 1995, the first time I directed. And I went through quite a long phase, in fact, I recall, of not being able to think, because I was so anxious about the possibilities I might let him down or something. But I wasn't even conscious of that. But I did say to him at one point, I'm having difficulty thinking about this conference. And then he said to me, well, I think it may be to do with my expectations of you. And the minute he said that, the problem went. It was quite amazing. So it was to do with those projections that he expected so much of me that I became a kind of riddled with anxiety, paralysed actually. I was not able to think about it at all.
So what was this feeling? Was it like you don't have to expect something, or I will do it my way, or was it just it was unspoken?
It was completely unspoken.
Yeah. And then it lost its
The minute he
pressure.
said it, That interpretation, it was brilliant actually. Well, he was interpreting himself, and quite right too, because I wasn't really aware of it. All I was aware of was that I couldn't think. But the minute he took it back, it released me, and then I was okay. But I did an enormous amount of preparation for that first conference, and I found I developed a template for myself actually about how to manage myself day by day. But I found once I started, I was fine. I did follow the template to kind of remind myself as an aide-memoire, but I found there was something about getting into the role of director. And what was most extraordinary about it, but quite a shock to me, was when I asked people to do things, they did them.
You realised your authority.
This had never happened before when I'd asked people to do things. They didn't necessarily do them. But in that role, they did. They did. And yes, I found my authority and I was able to delegate authority, and this was a revelation. And of course, once that began, I began to enjoy myself. So it became quite exhilarating, actually.
Who was your associate?
My associate director, the first time I did it, was Wesley Carr.
Wesley Carr.
Now, the reason for that was that I had wanted to direct earlier, and there had been an opportunity to do it in the early 1990s. But the person who would have been my associate director was Anton. And Anton had just taken up this role as chief executive of the Tavistock Clinic. And he wasn't available. He just couldn't do it. You know, he couldn't take the time and da-da-da-da. So I sort of waited a while, and I was his associate director on a couple of occasions. That was helpful. And ran the training group and stuff like that. So, and then Wesley took up the role for me. And that was great. That was great. That worked very well. And I'd been associate director to Wesley, and then Wesley was associate director to me
at Leicester.
And that was great. And he's excellent. I mean, you know, still to this day, very powerful mind, intellectually very, very sharp. But he also took up the role in a nice way. You know, he's very supportive. There was enough space for me. And I'm actually, on reflection, I'm not sure whether if Anton and I had done it together, whether I would have experienced as much room. Because, you know, Anton is a big person with a big personality. In fact, I recall one conference in the 1990s when I was his associate director. We had an enormous conference. I can't remember. I think with staff, there were 93 of us in the plenary room at Digby, and there were 13 staff.
Wow.
And we couldn't find enough chairs. And some of the staff, they'd found these chairs for little kiddies. Some of the staff were sitting on smaller chairs. We'd given the membership bigger chairs. Anyway, we were sitting in this row, and Anton came in and sat, a bit like Henry VIII. He came in and he took up his directorial position, and we were so crowded together, I was sort of tucked behind one of his shoulders.
Great.
But there was something kind of, I didn't really feel obliterated. There was something quite reassuring. He's sort of very dependable, the size of the man. But I think had the roles been reversed, I'm not sure I'd have felt there was quite enough room for me to manoeuvre. I'd have had to. But anyway, no, I learnt a lot working with him. And so Wesley did it. Wesley was my sort of support person. Because the first time you direct a conference, you need a very good, experienced associate director to sort of sweep up behind you and just, you know, help you think. Yes, so he did it.